For countless years, people have used silver and gold as their primary currency. And over those years, some of it was lost, stashed, or otherwise taken and hidden from history. These are the stories of America's buried treasures in your neck of the woods.
Today's treasure tale takes us back to our neighbors to the north, this time in the Yukon territory, in the search for McLeod's missing millions. This story is from the book Lost Bonanzas of Western Canada, edited by Garnet Basque. McLeod's missing millions. According to legend, discoverers Willie and Frank McLeod were the first of some 20 people who had been murdered or disappeared while searching for a rich gold mine in Nahanni National Park. McLeod's Lode, McLeod's missing millions, lost gold, Shangri-La Valley. These are but a few of the colorful names and spellings which have been attached to one of northern Canada's legendary lost treasures. Like all good treasure tales, the facts concerning this lost lode in the Northwest Territories has been all but lost in the haze of legends which have been circulating and growing during the past 3/4 of a century. In fact, no two writers seem to agree on much beyond the fact that somewhere in the northern reaches of Canada, a fabulously rich gold mine, its history tainted with murder, awaits some lucky discoverer. What most do not tell you is that the Northwest Territories, at a glance on a map will show, covers a lot of ground, something like 1.5 million square miles, almost half of Canada. This vast size, coupled with a total population of less than 50,000 persons, smaller than the average Canadian city, and some of the roughest terrain on the North American continent, make searching for a lost gold mine seem not only impossible, but insane. It also is dangerous, as according to popular legend, the search for this particular mine has claimed no fewer than 20 lives to date. Original legend. One popular version has it that the stories of gold along the reaches of the Nahanni River began as early as 1900, when a Nahanni Indian first appeared at Hudson Bay Company trading post with a sack full of gold chunks, which he spent with the abandon of a man who knew where to get plenty more. Although the rich brave was careful not to say too much to the white trappers and prospectors who crowded around him, he let it be known that he had found the gold in the dense wilderness south of the junction of the Flat and South Nahanni River, a dense, unknown region just south of the Yukon boundary, which had not known the presence of a white man since a handful of adventurers passed through on their way to the Klondike several years before. Those who knew this country spoke of treacherous rivers with giant eddies that could swallow an entire canoe and its occupants of muskeg. That was every bit as treacherous as quicksand, mosquitoes, and black flies that could eat a man alive. As if to write off the no man's land completely, native superstition included a curse. Local Indians whispered of a valley haunted by evil spirits, from which mere mortals did not return. The valley, the Shangri-La of modern-day legend, supposedly was an oasis in the Northland, with hot mineral springs and subtropical temperatures. When the surrounding mountains and valleys were deep in the subarctic snows, the evil valley reputedly remained warm and green, its demons constantly on the prowl. And for the Indian brave with the poke of nuggets, he seemed to have defined the tribal legends, and like true prospectors of all races, squandered his wealth on wine, women, and song, until broke. However, unlike the usual protagonists of good treasure stories, who go to the well once too often, he seems to have enjoyed his fleeing, then sadded, returned to his usual occupation as hunter and trapper. Within 3 years, his short-lived gold rush was forgotten by all but a few diehards prospectors. Not until 1903, when another Indian appeared with a poke of raw gold, did the stories of a lost and fabulous rich gold mine began to circulate the North Country. This time, at least storytellers had a little more to go on, as this native had cheerfully revealed the source of his find at Bannock Creek, a tributary to Flat River. Like the nearby South Nahanni, this too was forbidden country to Indians, yet for a second time, a brave had defied tribal taboo and had been rewarded with nuggets of gold. This time, the Nahanni's fame as a source of wealth was assured. As word spread of the wonderful valley where the sun always shone, and where steaming waters from hot springs trickled over creek beds, yellow with gold. But for all of the colorful stories being passed around, it remained for the two brothers named McLeod to begin the search, which goes on to this day. The half-breed sons of a Fort Laird factor from the HBC, Willie and Frank listened to the stories with growing interest, becoming convinced that with any luck at all, men with their bush experience and stamina could find the lost lode, thought to be at the southern end of the forbidden Mackenzie mountain range. For some reason, the brothers began their first expedition at Telegraph Creek in British Columbia, traveling overland to Flat River, the Nahanni's biggest tributary, by way of Dease Lake. It was as they worked their way along the flat that they encountered a party of Cashier Indians, who they later reported had been prospecting with some success. Frank later claimed that the natives had shown him nuggets the size of a chicken eggs. More than ever convinced that they were on the trail of Mother Fortune, the brothers tried to learn from the Indians where they had found the gold. But the cashiers were vague, and the brothers learned little. After searching the immediate vicinity without success, they pushed on to the junction of Bannock Creek and Flat River. It was in this area, so the story goes, that Frank and Willie McLeod struck pay dirt. In the short time remaining before the onslaught of winter, they collected a large array of samples, until running dangerously short of supplies. They had no choice but to head downstream. Constructing a crude scow from abandoned sluice boxes in the area, they poled their way downstream until a treacherous rapid, known as the Cascade of the 13 Drops, capsized their boat. Although they escaped with only a dunking and succeeded in righting their boat, they had lost all their precious cargo. Thus, when the brothers reached Fort Laird, hungry and tired, they were again broke. Even with the knowledge of a rich gold mine, they had to eat, and that winter they earned a grub stake for their next expedition by working for the HBC. Impatient to head back to Flat River, they worked hard and saved their wages. But despite their attempts to keep their gold mine a secret, word of their successful trip spread. The brothers began to enjoy their newfound notoriety and entertained one and all with incredible stories of a tropical valley and the South Nahanni River, which they described as being one of the most beautiful stretches of waterways they had ever seen. The strange valley, they said, was always warm, heated by numerous hot springs, and inhabited by all manners of wildlife, including exotic birds and butterflies. Most listeners must have received the McLeod's weird tale with reservation, few believing that such a valley could exist in the cold northern reaches of the Mackenzie. Only one man, identified as a Scottish engineer, named Wilkerson, or Weir, expressed full confidence in the brothers' stories. Not only did he believe every word that they said, but he wanted to accompany them on their next expedition. Curiously, Willie and Frank accepted this offer. perhaps deciding that any extra strong back would be of valuable use in the bush. Undoubtedly, Wilkinson's arrival meant a welcome boost to their grubstake as well, enabling them to head into the wild that much sooner. Whatever, Wilkerson joined the team, and in the spring of 1905, the three partners set out to find their fortunes. The summer passed, and it was autumn, then winter, yet the McLeods and Wilkinson failed to appear at Fort Laird as scheduled. When the spring and summer of 1906 slipped by, with winter once again approaching, a third brother, Charlie, began to grow concerned. However, it was a big country, and one rich in game. Willie and Frank were expert woodsmen, and well experienced at living off the land. If anyone could survive the brutal northern winters, he was sure his brothers could. But another year passed, and Willie, Frank, and Wilkinson failed to show. Not until the spring of 1908, 3 full years after they had set out on their second expedition to the Flat River, did Charlie McLeod decide to go search. A veteran outdoorsman himself, he had no difficulty in following their proposed route to the Flat River. On a rare occasion that he encountered a trapper or Indian hunter, he asked if they had seen 3 white prospectors, but the answer was always a silent shaking of the head. For months, Charlie pressed onward, until he observed the entrance to a large valley. Although running short of time, he remembered his brother's growing tale of a strange valley and decided to give it a cursory examination before heading back to civilization. As he paddled along, he became vaguely aware that the valley was different to the others he had explored. Here, it seemed warmer, the vegetation along the riverbanks seeming to grow thicker. When Charlie noticed a small clearing in the trees, he turned the bow of his canoe shoreward, his curiosity piqued. That this one particular spot in the lush growth, no trees grew. He had no sooner stepped onto the riverbank when he spotted the remains of an old sled runner in the grass. Upon picking it up, he was amazed to see that it bore writing, careful pencil scrawl, which he immediately knew to be that of one of his brothers. Undated, brief and to the point, the message read, "We have found a fine prospect." Although he searched the old campsite diligently, there was not another clue to be found, but at least he knew that Willie and Frank had been there, that he was on the right track. Eagerly, Charlie pushed deeper into the valley, some distance downstream. He sighted the obvious remains of another campsite and landed. The first thing to catch his eye was a rusted rifle leaning against a tree. A few feet away were 2 old bedrolls that unmistakably had belonged to his brothers, but it was his third discovery that staggered him, for beneath the bedrolls lay 2 skeletons. Charlie had found his brothers. Upon overcoming his horror, Charlie forced himself to examine the campsite and vicinity. However, no other clues were to be found. Of Wilkinson, the Scottish engineer, there was not a trace, and he sadly returned to Fort Laird to report his brother's death to the authorities. When Mounties returned to the death camp with Charlie, they too were unprepared for the scene which awaited them. For in his haste and the horror of discovering his brother's remains, Charlie had overlooked one terrifying item, the fact that both skulls were missing. Today, the legend of the McLeod deaths, and of their having been decapitated, have not only inspired a number of fascinating, if doubtful stories, but have changed the map. To this day, Dead Man Valley denotes the area in which their bodies were found, 3/4 of a century ago. The policeman's immediate reaction was that the remains had been mutilated by animals, but the fact that the skeletons were intact and still in their bedrolls seemed to outrule this possibility. Throughout his life, Charlie McLeod maintained that the decapitations had been almost surgically neat. It was his firm belief that his brothers had been murdered in their sleep by the missing Wilkinson, who had removed the heads so as to conceal the bullet wounds. As an arm of one of the skeletons appeared to be reaching for a nearby rifle at the moment of death, murder seemed to be the inevitable verdict, and that which most familiar was the story, except to this day. A thorough search of the old campsite turned up several pieces of gold-bearing quartz, but nothing rich enough to justify murder. This also indicated to Charlie McLeod that his brothers were killed, the fruits of their labors packed away by the murderer. A final curious fact was the brothers' picks and shovels were not to be found. To Charlie, this meant beyond a shadow of a doubt that Willie and Frank struck it rich, that their tools remained at the mine site, which must be nearby. The Mounties reserved judgment, unwilling to rule out the possibility that the brothers had died of natural causes. They also thought it possible that the McLeods could have been murdered along with Wilkinson, despite the absence of his corpse detected by Indians, or for what matter, by almost anyone. Whatever, Willie and Frank McLeod were buried beside the turbulent Nahanni. But if they were gone, they certainly were not to be forgotten. Charlie McLeod definitely was not about to forget his brothers, or their gold mine. Staunchly believing that he had deserved to find it, if anyone did, he proceeded to express his view at every opportunity that the missing Scotsman, Wilkinson, had murdered Willie and Frank, and formulated plans to return to Dead Man's Valley because of the macabre events surrounding his brother's death and his own vocal efforts. The legend of Dead Man's, or Headless Valley, and its murderous mine soon achieved international status. No respecting magazine or newspaper turned down an opportunity to tell and retell the story of the tropical valley where gold could be picked up from the ground and where men vanished by the score. Ironically, the articles began to prove themselves prophetic. When prospectors, many of them inexperienced and ill-equipped, proceeded to search for the McLeods, by then the legendary lode. As was to be expected, impatient and inexperienced in country such as this could lead only to tragedy. The fact that few prospectors bothered to report their safe return to civilization only added to the number of those that thought to have gone missing. Combined with the increased reluctance of Indians to travel through the region, the Nahanni's reputation as a jinxed and deadly river grew steadily. Most of those determined to flaunt the curse of Headless Valley began their expeditions at Fort Nelson, British Columbia, where they could hire inexperienced crews, flat-bottom riverboats, or buy canoes for the 100-mile journey down the Fort Nelson River to Nelson Forks, where they entered the Laird River for the final 200 miles of smooth passage to South Nahanni. There, the going got rough, with furious whirlpools and rapids, which did everything in their power to smash the adventurers' craft against the canoe walls, towering vertically from the river's edge. Fortunately, between such obstacle courses, the river was relatively easy to navigate, and offered those who survived the rapids sights that were as spectacular as any on the continent, including a waterfall more than 1,000 feet high and the shortest river in the world, an underground stream that broke the surface just 75 feet from its junction with the Nahanni. Making life all the more difficult for the prospectors was the fact that Nahanni then split into 6 channels, of which All but 2 were false leads. Many of those making the trip for the first time lost precious days in navigating the maze before being able to continue downriver, where most overlooked the entrance to Dead Man's Valley. Those who did succeed in probing the valley's mouth faced their next obstacle in not knowing preciously where the McLeods had made their last fatal camp. If, as Charlie McLeod believed to his dying day, Willie and Frank had struck it rich, it is reasonable to conclude that their mine lays within a short distance of their campsite. Those who traveled so far and against such obstacles only to miss the site entirely could hardly have hoped to find the mine, which remained a tantalizing mystery. One man is thought to have found the McLeod treasure. At least, it is known that he found gold. Unfortunately, he also found sudden death. Martin Bjornsson, a Swede, arrived on the scene the following year, inspired by the ever-growing tales of a rich mine somewhere along the banks or tributaries of the South Nahanni, and grub-staked by an ex-Mountie named Poole Field. He set out into the wilderness for 2 years. Field, then a trader at Ross River, heard not a word from the prospector. Then, much to his surprise and delight, a passing Indian delivered a hastily scribbled note. The message was from Bjornsson, who breathlessly told of having struck it rich. For Field's benefit, Bjornsson included a crude map showing the location of his cabin on the South Nahanni and urged him to come at once. When the Indian courier displayed the nuggets that Bjornsson had given him as payment for delivering the letter, Field immediately resolved to accept the Swede's invitation and see the claim for himself. But when Field stepped ashore at the site which Bjornsson had indicated as his camp, he was astonished to find the prospector's cabin burned to the ground. He was even more astonished when nearby he found a human skeleton, a broken rifle, and 2 spent cartridges. The remains, he was sure, were those of Martin Bjornsson. But how he died, the story behind the broken rifle and spent shells, has never been answered. Nor, for that matter, has the mystery of Bjornsson's reputed claim. For in his letter to Field, he gave no details as to the location, and the map merely showed the benefactor how to find the cabin. If Bjornsson had in fact found the lost McLeod lode, he too took the secret to his grave. The list of casualties in and about the South Nahanni grew steadily. In many instances, any link between the disappearance or death of the lost gold mine seems tenuous at best, but in 1931, a trapper named Phil Powers had let it be known that he was going in search of the treasure. Police informed that he had not reappeared, instituted a search, and found his remains. As in the case of Martin Bjornsson, his cabin had been burned to the ground. When discovered, a revolver lay within a few feet of the skeleton. Each of its 6 chambers had been fired, at least according to legend, if not record. And so it went, although usually those who fell victim to the curse did so under natural circumstances. Newspapers and magazines continued to reap sensational copy, and the legend of Dead Man's or Headless Valley and of malevolent forces that haunted white intruders grew and grew. One of those who did invade the valley on several occasions and live was Charlie McLeod, unable to turn his back on the valley that had claimed the lives of his brothers, and unwillingly to resist the lure of their supposed mine. He made 2 further expeditions, spaced many years apart, to the Nahanni. Years before the RCMP tentatively identified newly found human remains as those of Wilkinson, the missing Scotsman. and had concluded that he and Willie and Frank McLeod died by starvation. The brothers' remains had been mutilated by bears, despite their verdict. Charlie refused to believe that, and Wilkinson, or Weir, was dead and cited reports from his own investigation that indicated the missing prospector had been seen several times in Vancouver and elsewhere, and he had carried a fortune of gold out of the North Country. Though hundreds of inquiries and untiring research over the years, Charlie became convinced that his brother's mine would be found on Sheep Creek near Flat River, which poured into the Nahanni but a few miles from the McLeod's last camp. But with a growing family, he confined himself to asking questions and repeating his charge that Wilkinson had murdered his brothers until 1942, when, with several others, he explored the banks of Sheep Creek. Although the party did find gold and some copper, it was not a rich lode that Charlie was convinced his brothers had found, and he returned to his home in Alberta as frustrated as ever. In 1950, with his 3 sons, the determined Charlie McLeod made a last determined attack on Sheep Creek, now known as McLeod Creek, in misspelled honor of his brothers. To the sons' surprise, they found the Nahanni an evil repute, the so-called Dark River of Fear, to be beautiful and a rugged river. At the camp, where the mutilated skeletons of Uncles Willie and Frank had been found, they discovered that the shifting of the river had long since washed away the graves. Despite an exhaustive search of both Flat River and Sheep Creek, the second-generation McLeod party found little evidence of a fabulously rich mine, although there were ample signs of placer gold and copper about. This was the last time that Charlie McLeod ventured into the wilds of the Nahanni in Dead Man's Valley. Despite his own lack of success, however, Charlie maintained until his dying day that when found, the McLeod's mine would be somewhere near McLeod Creek. Summary and conclusion. An authority on the South Nahanni and surrounding wilderness was the late R.M. Patterson, who first ventured into this region against the advice of all who knew of his plan over 50 years ago. His subsequent book, The Dangerous River, now a classic of Canadian North, established him as an author and has been reprinted in many times over the years. According to Patterson, it had been rumored that the McLeod brothers learned of gold somewhere along the Flat River from an Indian their father had befriended years before. Outfitting in Vancouver, the 3 McLeods, Willie, Frank, and Charlie, proceeded to Wrangell, Alaska, by steamer. Heading up the frozen Stickeen River by dog team, they found their way along midwinter on Telegraph Creek, then on to the north end of Dease Lake, before following Dease River through the Cedar Mountains to Laird Plains. Finally, after having overcome every obstacle winter in the north could throw at them, the determined trio reached the upper Flat River. There at last, their ordeal was rewarded with an encounter with Caesar Indians, who showed them large coarse nuggets, worth up to $3 each. Something less than legendary nuggets as big as hen's eggs, but respectable nevertheless. As it was now spring, the brothers decided to try their hand panning the stream, which they exuberantly christened Gold Creek. The Caesars, apparently content with having had first crack at the creek bed, and likely less than enchanted with the McLeod's arrival, moved on to fresher fields. But despite much hard work and the use of the Indians' abandoned sluice boxes, the brothers found only enough gold to fill a tiny bottle. As the season was advancing, they agreed to head for home and constructed a crude boat from the sluice boxes. However, upon being capsized in the infamous cascade of the 13 Drops, Flat River Canyon, they lost everything but a rifle with several shells and returned to their original camp on Gold Creek. Spirits revived after shooting a moose. They did some more panning and sluicing before building a second scow from the sluice boxes, and tried again to descend the treacherous flat. This time, they made it home to Fort Laird without mishap. The next year, convinced they would have better luck, Willie, Frank, and an unnamed Scotsman engineer decided to return to Flat River. When they failed to come out, Charlie, in due course, found their remains. Although popular legend has it that they had been decapitated, Patterson said that he had also been told many times that when found, the McLeod skeletons had been tied to trees. As Patterson noted, it was highly unlikely that the remains would have laid undisturbed for 3 years, as he knew all the well the country was alive with bears and wolves, which would undoubtedly mutilate the bodies and ransack the campsite. Curiously, it had remained for adventurer author Patterson in 1952 to formally ask the RCMP just what conclusions they had come to in the case of the ill-fated McLeods 46 years before. The Ottawa Department of Records promptly replied that according to the investigation of 1909 and a review of the case made in 1921, the McLeods died of starvation and exposure after having set out from Fort Laird with insufficient food and equipment. As for Jornson, the other prospector supposedly murdered, the RCMP stated flatly that it had no record whatsoever of his having been declared missing, let alone murdered. Thus, almost half a century after, Patterson seems to have publicly stamped case closed on both files, thanks to the RCMP's records department. He also, as much as any other man, laid to rest the legend that no white man survived the South Nahanni curse. Patterson survived the so-called jinx not once but 3 times. He did admit, however, that several others were not as fortunate, although he listed their deaths as being accidental or the result of inexperience or overconfidence. After he returned to Victoria, Patterson told his writer that he disagreed with the RCMP verdict of death by starvation as far as the McLeods were concerned. He had, he said, camped on the spot where the brothers died in 1928, although he had been unaware of the campsite's grim history at the time. He gave it as his opinion that Willie and Frank McLeod were indeed murdered, but by whom and for what purpose he did not say. As for McLeod's fabulous gold mine, he saw not a sign. Others over the years have claimed to have made good showings along the tributaries of the South Nahanni and Flat Rivers, but none seem to have struck it rich, and after the inevitable headlines silenced again, returns to the mysterious North Country, where the McLeods met their fate, from whatever cause 3/4 of a century ago. But as long as the legend of the McLeods and the Dead Man's or Headless Valley live, the search for their reputed treasure will go on, and just as likely, the casualty list will grow. Good luck, happy hunting, keep on digging it. Like, subscribe, and share it with a friend. Hit the bell and follow me on my next outing. Good luck, happy hunting, keep on digging it. For even more to explore, check out these other videos.